"Allender, are you ready?" the husband called. They went to the mountains for 2 weeks to hunt elk. She was looking for her foam mat. She knew that sleeping on the ground would be very uncomfortable without some kind of foam between her body and the ground might be damp and cold. "Brian, have you seen my rug?" "I already put it in the truck," he responded. She grabbed her backpack from the floor by the door, and they walked towards the truck. The trip promised to be long. Brian Solin watched as his wife walked outside and down the sidewalk. He still couldn't believe that he had convinced her to marry him. They had been married for 3 months, and his heart was racing every time he looked at her. She was a tall, slender, dark-haired girl. Her hair was black with a bluish tint. She was wearing tight blue jeans and a buttoned-up white blouse. She looked so sexy that he wanted to call her back and have sex right now. She clearly wasn't wearing a bra. She was bright and athletic. She climbed inside and looked at him. "What?" she asked. "I just can't believe how beautiful you are." She smiled, white teeth flashing against her creamy face. She had rare, pale, almost translucent skin, and was cautious as she spent a lot of time outdoors, running around their neighborhood every morning and spending many days by the backyard pool. They both loved hiking and hunting. This was the second time they had been together, and he knew she was a good shot with any weapon. Her father raised deer and elk in the Upper Peninsula, and they looked forward to hunting. She hoped to take at least one of them. Brian wasn't much of a bow hunter, but he admired it. She looked at her boyish husband and felt something warm inside. She knew how lucky she was. He was an amazing lover, and Allender couldn't get enough of him. They were going to wait a little longer to have children. They simply enjoyed being married. Brian was a dream come true for her. They met during their senior year of college, and she knew she had found the other half of her soul. There was just something about him that made her melt. He was smart, witty, and had a sense of humor that matched hers. He was an outdoors man just like her, and he was the hottest man she had ever met. Those big brown eyes, a swimmer's body, and a stunning lover. Allender was in love, lusted after, and married the man she wanted to spend the rest of her life with. It was a long way from Colorado, so they stopped for the night in Des Moines. Towards the evening of the next day, they entered a leadoux and met their guides there. They were introduced, and they immediately liked one of them. Peter Thompson was a little cowboy about 5 feet 8 inches tall and weighing 120 pounds. He looked to be in his late 40s, wiry and light on his feet. The second guide was Rains Parker. He was completely different. He was about 6 feet 5 inches tall, weighed 250 pounds, and looked like a refugee from the 60s. He had long black hair and a ponytail and was very quiet. Allender thought he looked like he was in his early 20s and was very handsome. His arms were heavy with muscle and it looked like he had no neck. When he shook her hand, she felt very small. Since she was almost 6 feet tall herself, she was a little alarmed. "Don't pay any attention to Rains," Peter chuckled. "In the 3 months that I've known him, he hasn't said even 500 words. He is a college student. He played football for the Raiders for a time, but he knows the forest. His father was a forester in these parts, and he knows the area like the back of his hand." They had dinner, and Brian and Allender tried bison for the first time. Rains prepared the food, and she came over to ask if she needed help. "No, I can handle it myself," he said. His voice was the deepest bass Allender had ever heard. If a grizzly bear could talk, she thought that's what it would sound like. "You can set the table if you want," he said. "The dishes are in that closet over there. Silverware in the bottom drawer." She set the table, and Peter poured her some good red wine. The bison was delicious, and Rains was a good cook. They talked about where they would go, and when she mentioned that she wanted to use a bow, Rains's eyes lit up. "Do you hunt with a bow?" she asked him. He nodded. "What kind of bow do you have?" he asked. "I shoot a 65-pound bear bow with Quest Power Punch arrows with 125-grain Hellraiser dots," she said. "I'm learning to use a long bow, but I'm not confident enough to try it yet. I'm making my own bow, but it's not ready yet." He looked at her for a while. "I'm surprised and impressed. Most women cannot cope with such a burden." "Well, this is something new," Peter laughed. "Rains is not easy to impress. Do you bow hunt too, Brian?" No, it's too much work for me, Brian laughed. Well, let's send these two, and we'll kill someone too, Peter said to Brian. Last season, my clients and I killed 5 moose Allender, Rains said. Her big blue eyes sparkled with excitement. I want something tasty, she said. It doesn't have to be huge, but I want good things. Brian also just wants moose. He'll get it, Rains told her. If he can get Peter to shut up and come closer. Peter is really very good. They went to bed early and got up at 6 in the morning. It was very cold, and Allender shivered until she put on her gear. They put on many layers of clothes, and by the time Allender got dressed, Rains had already prepared breakfast. They ate quickly, hurrying to leave, and when they finished, Rains tied the horses outside. Allender tied the bow to the saddle, and they climbed into the saddle. She was a little stiff from yesterday's ride, and her joints felt like they were creaking. She soon straightened up and, as they left the path, kissed Brian. Brian and Peter continued on their way, and Rains led her along a winding path that skirted the mountain and climbed steeply up the slope. They drove for about an hour, and suddenly a view of the Great Canyon opened up in front of her. Rains took his glasses out of his saddlebag, and she followed him. At 3 o'clock, he told her, about 2 miles from here, on the other side of these aspen trees. She looked and saw half a dozen moose moving across the clearing. What do you think? She asked. From here, the second bull looks quite large. He's quite nice, he told her. He's not a record holder, but he's very nice. Are you interested? Are you hoping to find something better? She asked him. Yes, but you have to look for it. Let's try it and see what we can come up with. Best the enemy of the good. She agreed, and they drove into the canyon. By the time Rains arrived and dismounted, it was hot, and Allender was getting hot. They tied the horses, and she took off 2 layers. She felt like she was being watched and looked at Rains. He looked at her with obvious approval. What the heck? She felt a little awkward. Her face flushed slightly, and she turned to him. What? Nothing. You are a very beautiful woman. I'm sorry if I caused you any inconvenience. She shrugged. Brian always tells me this. For some reason, she felt like she should mention her husband. Forget. Let's go hunting. She lowered her bow and took out her arrows. They came closer to the place where the elk had just been and looked in there. Allender's heart sank. They were half a mile away and moving on. Well, let's try to get ahead of them? She asked. No, I don't think so, Rains said thoughtfully. We would have to climb over this wall and we wouldn't be able to take the horses. By the time we get up, there is no telling where they will be. Let's go into the next canyon to the south and see what we find there. They made 2 more passes that day. One of them was empty, and Allender didn't want the bull to get close enough. His horn was broken, and Rains agreed that she should give it up. It was already late, and they decided to return. They rode in companionable silence most of the way. Before they reached the hut, Rains stopped. I have an idea, he said. It means getting up around 3 and driving for 3 hours, but there's a big bull there that I'd love to take you on. What do you think? I'm in the game. Look, Rains, I'm not disappointed about today. I just love being here. I want moose, but that's just a bonus. Being in this place hunting, that's what's important to me. Brian and Peter were already back when they arrived. They had seen the elk, but were in a canyon that they could not reach from their position, and were planning to try to capture it tomorrow. They had dinner, and the next morning, Allender and Rains set off early. It was very cold when they got up, and they quickly had breakfast and saddled their horses before the others got up. The ride through the dark forest had left Allender a little unsettled, and she was glad that Rains was with her and knew where they were going. As the sun rose, they approached the place where they wanted to hunt, and at 10:30, Allender noticed a group of elk in the aspen thickets. They followed and found themselves within 200 yards of the largest moose Allender had ever seen. It started to rain, and the moose were restless. We have to do this now, Rains whispered. They are going to move to a more reliable shelter. When we rise, you take it. You have a chance. This is a very good bull, Allender. She moved closer, waiting for the bull to lower his head so he could lunge. He turned a little more to the side, and Allender, bending down, released an arrow. It was a perfect shot, just behind the front leg and just below center. The huge animal shuddered and rushed forward, as if fired from a cannon. Allender was shaking with adrenaline and rushed at Rains. "Did you see that?" "I got him, Rains. You couldn't have taken a better shot." Her arms wrapped around his neck, and she pulled him in for a hug and a kiss on the cheek. "It's huge. How long do we have to wait before we go looking for him?" She calmed down a little and realized that her body was wrapped around him, and she blushed even more. She pulled herself free and moved away a little. "Let's take the horses and then go after him," Rain suggested. It was raining heavily and the temperature seemed to be plummeting. The sky was completely overcast and cold steam rose from the ground. They led their horses to the place where she had shot the arrow and began to search for the trail. They made easy progress through the aspen thickets, and when, after a quarter of a mile, they reached the edge of the meadow, they quickly discovered the elk almost exactly in the center of the clearing. Allender asked Rains to take some photos, and she also took a photo of him standing by the elk. They immediately went to work bandaging the animal, and Rains helped her quarter him. They wrapped him in the plastic he had brought with him and placed him in canvas bags for transport. By the time they tied him to the horses, it was snowing heavily, and visibility was close to zero. The wind began to howl, and strangely enough for Allender, lightning crackled all around. She was very scared, and Rains was walking pretty fast. Half a mile later, he stopped in front of her and got off his horse. He put his hand to her ear and screamed to be heard over the howling wind. "There's a stone wall about 20 feet ahead. Keep an eye out for an overhang, a rubble, a cave, or anything we can use for cover. We need to find a place to sit." She nodded. They moved forward and a wall came into view. They walked along it for about half a mile, and it gradually ended. "We have to go back the other way and look for it," Rains shouted in her ear. Now the ground was covered with snow, and it was getting thicker. They returned, and after walking 100 yards, they could no longer see their tracks. Allender was dressed in good gear, but water had leaked in some places, and she was shivering as the warmth drained from her body. A dark opening in the wall appeared ahead. Rains dismounted and examined it. It was large at the entrance and went out about 15 feet before shrinking into a narrow throat. They led the horses into the first room and looked into the narrow passage. Beyond the neck, they saw another small room, about 6 feet by 6 feet. Allender was shaking uncontrollably, and Rains knew she was in trouble. "I'll go look for wood to make a fire," he said. "Take everything off the horses if you can. We can use the blankets and pads they have under their saddles. Find my lighters in my backpack, and I'll start a fire as soon as I can. Work will help you stay warm." Allender was so cold that she could barely concentrate, but she began to unsaddle the horses when Rains took the axe and disappeared into the snow. She cursed her stupid, stiff fingers as she fiddled with the girths. She managed to remove the saddles, and she placed the pads on the floor of the small room, on top of which lay the blankets. She put down her foam pillow and placed pillows and blankets on it. After clumsily rummaging through Rain's backpack, she managed to open it and find a dry bag with 3 lighters and a can of liquid inside. She made a circle of large stones just inside the narrow part of the shallow cave. The smoke should come out when they build a fire there, and it will also give the horses some warmth. By the time she finished, Rains had returned with an armful of dry wood that he had broken off from standing trees. He quickly broke off small branches and used them to build a small wigwam in the center of the stone circle. He gradually broke larger pieces until there were pieces the size of his wrist on top. Allender helped, and soon they had a decent pile. Rains sprayed lighter fluid on the smallest branches and wet them well. He made a small trace of the liquid and lit it with a lighter. The flame ran up the trail, and the pile burst into flames. 10 minutes later, they made a good fire, and Allender stretched out her frozen hands to the fire. She trembled and chirped her teeth. Rains was very worried when he looked at her and saw that her lips were bluish in color. "Allender, are you wet?" "Yes, some of my clothes are wet and I'm freezing." she said, through chattering teeth. "We need to dry your clothes," he told her. "You'll never stay warm as long as you're in wet clothes. Take off everything wet and wrap yourself in blankets. We'll hang your clothes on sticks by the fire to dry." The last thing she wanted was to undress in the cold air, but she was frozen. "Don't look," she told him. "I swear," he promised. "Do you want to be modest or lively?" She walked away and stripped down to her bra and panties. Her bra was also wet and she took it off, quickly wrapping herself in the blanket. She hurried back to the fire as Rains gathered her clothes. He stuck sticks into the stones and hung her clothes on the sticks closer to the fire. She was still shaking uncontrollably, and Rains became very worried. She was unlikely to recover beyond a certain point of hypothermia and needed to be warmed up quickly. She was very sleepy and lethargic and did not notice how he took off his clothes. She perked up a little when he picked her up and laid her on the saddle cushions, which he brought closer to the fire. She felt a rush of cold air as he opened the blankets and then felt his warm skin against her cold body. He shuddered when he felt her nearby. She felt him lay her back on the saddle cushions, and his heavy body lay upon her, deliciously warm and spreading comfort through her. Allender floated in a sleepy haze, shuddering every now and then as the core of her body, trying to conserve heat, sent tremors through her. She felt her nipples, very erect from the cold, scraping against his chest as they breathed, and this sensation seemed somehow wrong to her, but in her daze she could not pinpoint this thought, and she did not have the strength to continue her. The fire grew as it began to consume large sticks, and embers began to form. The air in the small room warmed, and Allender began to warm up little by little, the combination of her body heat and the heat from the fire keeping her warm. She became more aware of her surroundings and the fact that she was under the covers, almost naked with a nearly naked man who was not her husband. "Rains?" She looked into his eyes. "I'm very sorry, Allender," he apologized. "For me, you are a very attractive woman. We are practically naked here, and we will sit like this for a while. I'm not a very sociable guy. I don't think I've ever met a woman like you. You are everything I could ever imagine wanting in a woman. If you were fat and ugly, the fact that you are so independent, smart, funny, and interested in everything I have would make me want you. You're not fat or ugly. You are stunningly beautiful. You have a body to die for, and I can feel those big breasts pressing against me. You feel like silk, and it's very exciting. I think this is the most I've talked to anyone in a year." "Thank you, Rains, that's very flattering. But I'm married," she said. "I understand that perfectly," he said. "I'm trying to act like a gentleman." "I appreciate it," she said. "Let's forget about it. Let's just stay here and try to stay warm. Do you mind if I sleep? Maybe it will be better this way." "How long do you think we will stay here?" "I have no idea," Rains replied. "This could happen in a few hours, or maybe in a few days. We won't starve, but we will be thirsty if we don't melt the snow. I have several pans that we can use. I really don't want to leave you here, but I need more wood. I'll use the walkie-talkie and let Peter and your husband know that we're safe and hiding in the cave." "I'll be fine," she said. "Now I feel warmer. As soon as my clothes are dry, I will help you. I don't need help right now. You were just scared. Just stay here and I'll come back." Within an hour, he had stacked a huge supply of firewood, including several large logs inside the cave, and turned around some of the elk they had taken. He cut strips from the waste and put them on green sticks, placing them on the edge of the fire. As the juices began to drip and sizzle, a delicious aroma began to permeate the air. He went out and brushed the snow, now over a foot deep, aside and tore off huge tufts of grass, bringing them inside for the horses to eat. He hobbled them, not that they could go far in such a storm, and the elk stripes were already reedy. Allender turned them over the fire, her stomach growling. Her clothes were not yet dry, so she was wrapped in blankets. Rains took salt out of his backpack and they ate. It was the most delicious thing Allender had ever tasted. It tasted like very tender beef, and they ate everything they had prepared. Rains took 2 metal pans and filled them with snow. They melted the snow over the fire and connected them. He went back and got more, and they repeated the process until they had about half a gallon of clean water. He placed it in the outer cave to cool and covered the fire with large logs to last the night. It was already completely dark, and they decided to get some sleep. Allender stood up, and they made a kind of mattress out of the saddle pads. It was narrow, less than 3 feet wide, and they barely fit. She lay down, and Rains stripped down to his boxers and socks. She didn't want to look, but her eyes were inevitably drawn to him. He was incredibly muscular. His professional football background was obvious. He had several large scars on his knees where he had apparently had surgery. He didn't have the big belly she usually associated with football players. She guessed he must have lost a lot of weight from his football days. He slid under the covers next to her. She immediately felt warmer and at the same time very uncomfortable. The only way for both of them to stay on the pads is to either lie on their sides with their bodies touching or at least half on top of each other. Allender turned her back to Rains, and he did the same. His back seemed very wide and warm to her, and the awkwardness of the situation kept her from falling asleep for a long time. Rains seemed to have no such difficulty, and his breathing was slow and heavy. The rhythm lulled her, and she dozed off. When she woke up, it was pitch black, and she thought she had slept for a couple of hours. They tossed and turned in their sleep until Rains was on his back, and she was laying on top of him. Her cheek rested on his chest, and her breasts were pressed against his side. When she woke up, she was unconsciously rubbing herself against his thigh and was terrified. She felt his hand slide along her back and realized with horror that he was awake and knew what she was doing. She didn't know if he knew she was awake and thought she would just carefully turn her back to him. She began to move, and suddenly his hand slid down and cupped her buttocks, pressing her against his thigh. The touch caused an involuntary movement, and her plan to quietly roll over was thwarted. This was the most awkward situation Allender had ever found herself in, and she silently cursed her traitorous body for putting her here. He flexed his hip, and it made her move again, and a moan almost escaped her lips. Her hips continued to squirm slowly, something she couldn't control. She found it very difficult to think. The feeling that left her empty was still strong in her mind. She felt his hot breath ruffle the little hairs on the back of her head as he nibbled on her earlobe. Goosebumps ran down her arms. "Oh God," she breathed. "Rains, you're killing me." These were the first words they spoke. "You're so hot, Allender," he whispered. "God, you're so hot and you're so beautiful. I cannot do anything." As their movement slowed and stopped, his heavy weight on her felt so warm and soothing that she floated in a sea of sexual euphoria. Rains pulled away from her and hugged her, holding her close as they regained their strength. Her mind began to clear, and when the enormity of what had happened fully dawned on her, she began to cry. She trembled and sobbed as he held her. "What happened, Allender?" he asked softly. "Damn you, Rains," she sobbed. "I shouldn't have allowed this to happen. I love my husband and have never even thought about another man. Now I'm a cheater, and it will never be the same for me. I despise myself, and I hate you for it. How am I going to meet Brian? Get your hands off me, Rains. I'll go check if my clothes are dry." She stood, and he watched with regret as her incredible naked figure disappeared into the now dry clothes. She returned to the blankets and crawled into them. "You will meet him face to face as always," he said. "Nobody will ever know that this happened. I'll never tell. We are two people trapped in a situation that neither of us intentionally created. We didn't cause the storm. We didn't plan to freeze. How in the name of all that is holy can you expect anything else? We were two adults, naked in a pile of blankets in the middle of a snowstorm. It happened, and I refused to feel bad about it. In fact, I liked it, and so did you. You came 100 times. I am not your husband's rival in love. I know you love him, and nothing we did will change that. The truth is, I'm sorry. I wish I had met you first, but this did not happen. We've been stuck here for God knows how long, and I'm with the sweetest, most gorgeous, most interesting woman I've ever met. She was naked in my arms, and I swear to God, I don't regret a thing. Aren't you warm now?" Allender laughed. Well, yes, that's a plus. Rains, I truly love Brian and I wouldn't leave him for anyone else, not even you. Are you seriously trying to take this away from me? If you give me even the slightest trouble, I will come back here, hunt you down and kill you. You'll never see me coming. Quite seriously, Allender, he said, I'm not trying to steal you for myself. I know that you are not mine and will never be mine, but I was lucky. I borrowed you for a while. I can live with it if you can. Now, I don't really like myself either, but this is not a normal situation. I know how it happened. I know that you are not a cheater. It's just not in you. If that were the case, I wouldn't be attracted to you. We are under a lot of stress, in an emergency situation, and this just happened. I pray to God that you will be mine. You don't, and I will regret it for the rest of my life. I'll just have to live with it. You will leave, we will never see each other again, and life will go on. The next chapter in your life will be without my participation. Allender looked outside. The snow stopped falling and she saw stars in the sky. After we leave here, if I ever hear your name or see you again, I swear I will hunt you down and put an arrow in your heart. Be sure. I'm leaving. Are you coming? Allender was silent the entire way home. She didn't know what to do. Her first reaction was to silently live with herself and her guilt, be the best wife a man had ever had, and spend the rest of her life making Brian deliriously happy. These thoughts haunted her for 100 miles. She will never be able to live at peace with herself. She could never be that deceitful or insincere. Brian deserves better. Damn, she realized, he deserved better than her. She will pay the piper when they return home. She curled up miserably and fell asleep.